It's so nice to be here with all of you today to address a topic that affects billions of people every day. And it's especially nice to be able to do that in Denmark, a country with such a tradition of focus on freedom of expression. In today's world, you really can't pick up a newspaper without seeing some sort of controversy about online speech. It's COVID misinformation, it's Russian trolls, it's anti-immigrant hate speech, the list goes on. So much controversy, in fact, that it's sometimes easy to forget that on the big questions, democratic governments and tech companies tend to be somewhat aligned. That is, they agree that freedom of expression is important, and they also agree that there are certain types of speech, child sexual exploitation imagery, intellectual property theft. These are areas where companies and democratic governments tend to agree there need to be restrictions. The tension comes in the nuances of how we put those restrictions in place. And specifically with the increasing external pressure that Jacob referenced, we see these tensions grow greater and greater. The past few years have seen unprecedented efforts to revisit the way that tech companies moderate content and to put more pressure on them to remove more speech. This has included boycotts led by civil society asking advertisers to boycott companies. It's included a swell of regulatory efforts. We're now tracking more than 100 content-focused, speech-focused regulations across the world. And it's included a dramatic rise in requests from government for demands, really. I mean, these are orders that governments give companies to remove content from their site. This is content that the local governments want down, but that does not violate the company's standards. We call those government takedown requests. So just to put this in perspective, in 2019, the first half of 2019, Meta received about 18,000 such requests. In the first half of this year, we received about 90,000 requests. Those are global numbers. But that gives you a sense that the increase in government takedown requests has increased by a factor of 5 in the past 3 years. Now, despite these increased pressures, tech companies tend to be wary of changing their practices to remove more speech. And that perspective is really informed by the tech company's unique knowledge of how changes to the content moderation process will play out in the longer term. And what I mean by that, namely, is the unintended casualties, the unintended speech casualties, removal of legitimate expression that comes when we play at the margins of these content moderation processes. That wariness really comes from two types of concerns that the companies have. And the first is the knowledge of their own limitations when it comes to accurate enforcement. So when you're playing at the margins again, if society deems a certain type of expression illegitimate, and you move that line a little bit, there's going to be, because of the accuracy challenges, legitimate expression that also comes down. And then second, companies know that when they take a step to remove more speech, that at the time, in the immediate situation, may look like it makes good sense, that's going to set a precedent that will stifle legitimate expression in the future, including by authoritarian regimes, and Jacob referred to this, who will look to how democratic societies have acted and say, oh, okay, well, they can do it, we can do it. It has quite a different effect. So we'll get to that second concern later about the precedent setting, but first let's look at a few examples of the types of accuracy challenges that companies will inevitably face. I mean, these are not going to be solved. This is just a reality of moderating content. Even the most developed and well-resourced tech companies face these challenges with content moderation. We've built technical tools at Meta. We've been doing this a long time. We have quite a big engineering team focused on this. And we've built these technical tools, but many of them are still quite blunt. I think about times when our technology has removed legitimate expression, and then we've looked at it and said, oh my gosh, it was a mistake, we have to put it up. During the height of ISIS some years ago, I remember getting a call from one of the terrorism academics that we work with externally, and he said, you've removed one of the major counter-ISIS pages in the Middle East. So of course we put it back up, we'd made a mistake. When we looked at it, our technology had seen ISIS-related commentary and imagery and deemed the page ISIS-related, but the reality was it was satire. It was seeking to discredit ISIS and discourage people from joining it. So even when you have a perfect policy line in place, which doesn't exist, but even if there were a perfect policy line, technology just can't get you all the way there because it may be good at filtering certain words or images, but it's not good at understanding the context. Now, people can do a better job of understanding context, but frankly, we as human beings have our limits too. This is true in the world of misinformation. When you think about misinformation, companies get a lot of demands to remove misinformation or take other action on misinformation, but the reality is there's not a reliable, magical source of truth for companies to consult. At Meta, we part with leading health organizations, safety organizations, more than 80 independent fact-checking organizations around the world. And sometimes even those experts, they can basically review content and then we'll remove it or we'll label it according to our policies. Sometimes even those experts, they don't have an answer. They'll say, we can't rate this, we don't know. Or worse yet, they'll disagree with one another about whether something is true or false. That's partly why we've adopted the nuanced system we have, where we have a system of labels and we'll try to be focused on giving people authoritative information. In many cases, that is our solution. But that's not something that all tech companies can do, and it's certainly none of these systems for treating misinformation are perfect. And even with the more standard policies like hate speech or incitement to violence, even there, the human review forces, they're people. People make mistakes. And as the policies become more complicated, the mistakes go up. That's a reality I've seen in 10 years of doing this. Every layer of nuance that you add to your content policies, you're going to have more enforcement mistakes. And beyond that, it's some of these challenges for reviewers. There is no clear right call. Think about the video of Neda Sultan, a protester in Iran who was gunned down back in 2009. Or the photograph of Aylan Kurdi, the little Syrian boy who was fleeing his homeland with his family, and there was an image of, after his boat capsized, an image of his poor lifeless body on the beach, this little 3-year-old. Horrific imagery, super important for raising public awareness about what was happening in the world. And so our policies say if that image is shared to raise awareness, we allow it. But we also remove that imagery if somebody is sharing that content to mock the victims or to celebrate what happened to them. Now, that's easy in some cases. If you have the video of Neda Sultan and the person is saying, I stand with the Iranian people, okay, leave it up. If they're sharing that same video and they've got a laughing emoji, okay, take it down. But there's a whole lot of stuff in the middle there. What do you do with that video if the caption simply says, watch this? Or what do you do if there's no caption at all? So that's the landscape. The technical tools are often blunt, and people are people. They're going to make mistakes, and they just won't have all the context all the time to make the right decisions. Now, this doesn't mean that regulation is necessarily bad. It can be good. It can be good if it helps create the kind of transparency that informs the public debate about what is actually present on these platforms. We see a lot of misconceptions about, for instance, the level of violating speech on these platforms. We started a couple measures. We publish quarterly reports where we talk about this is the amount of content we've removed in each category, and this is the prevalence, meaning we actually go back and look. We do a statistically significant sample, and we say how much of this violating content is actually on the site. You know, those numbers are actually pretty low. And when you hear a lot of the news headlines today, you would think that these sites are awash in hate speech or violence, and it's way less than 0.1% in most cases. And so regulation that actually requires that kind of transparency can bring about more thoughtful regulations. But I mention these challenges with accuracy because if you are a company who's facing regulations that punish you, if you have a certain type of speech, any instances of it that are deemed to be illegitimate by that regulation, well, then you have to move those lines in a way that is necessarily going to take down or stifle legitimate expression. Now, these challenges are also smaller for smaller companies who have fewer resources. We have language coverage in dozens of languages, and we have thousands of content reviewers around the world. Smaller companies don't have that. They may cover content in only 1 or 2 languages. So if regulation forces them to turn up the dials on their policies, on the way that they use scanning, then that means they're going to have to just understand that they're going to be stifling legitimate expression as well. Now, in addition to the fallibility of their systems, the tech companies also worry about the precedents that they set for future speech when they restrict it in an immediate situation. We see this all the time. There's public outcry to remove certain speech. Let's say it's speech about an election, saying that an election was delegitimate. Restricting that speech may be tempting if we believe that the election was fair. But what we know is that civil and political rights around the world are under threat, and many elections are not free and fair. So we have to be careful as democratic societies if we restrict that kind of speech, what precedent that creates for speech under authoritarian regimes or where elections are not free and fair. And unless we want private companies to be making decisions about which elections are free and fair, that's a dangerous line to cross. Another issue that may seem straightforward at first, removing content that breaks a country's laws, even when it doesn't violate a company's policies. And sometimes you can look at that and say, well, this is a disagreement at the margins about what constitutes hate speech. But other times we have countries that ask us to remove speech simply because it criticizes a local government. And when we've created a precedent of using technical tools, as some democratic countries have asked us to do, using technical tools to scan and find and remove content that is locally illegal, just consider the precedent that that creates for authoritarian regimes to do the same thing. So what is the path forward for sensible regulation? First, of course, we need constructive dialogue between governments and tech companies to inform the governments about what's likely to happen with certain regulations if they enact them. Bilateral relationships work here, so do some of the efforts we've seen, like the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism. Next, we need comprehensive frameworks. This is really difficult. It's, of course, easier for governments to act individually, but the more nuance that you inject into the system, the more regulations that different companies have to follow, the more those accuracy challenges, the more those precedent challenges are brought to the forefront. And in terms of substance, the regulation should seek first to inform the public discourse about online speech, such as requiring companies to provide data or putting in accountability measures for the companies to be transparent about their efforts. Without that, regulators are regulated in the dark because they simply won't have the information that they need to understand what speech looks like on these platforms. Finally, we need a clear articulation of any standards or duty of care with carve-outs for good faith moderation efforts. That's the only way to limit the risk of over-censorship. It's a lot to ask. Developing thoughtful regulatory frameworks, it takes a lot of effort, especially with an issue this complicated. But it matters so much for all the reasons that Jacob said. There are many well-intentioned people across the world that want to be part of this discussion. I know many of the people in this room fall into the roles that will lead them to have influence in this conversation. And I'm grateful to be part of that conversation. I hope that, as Jacob said, we can all use our voices to get to a place where freedom of expression is respected online. Thank you.